Hello, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's fourth space, and thank you for joining us for today's event, Evaluating Excellence, the Implications of Bibliometric Indicators for Equity. And to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube live from fourth space, located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Here at fourth space, we work with the university community to help mobilize knowledge, co-creating daily activities, examining research questions, projects, things in development here at the university. We're running this event today as a live stream Zoom meeting, so we welcome comments, questions in the chat. Those of you in the space, of course, if you'd like to participate, just let us know. Raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. But to start things off, it's very much my pleasure to hand things over to the Associate Vice President of Research, Development, and Outreach, also Professor in Geography, Planning, and Environment, Monica Moran. Monica, welcome.
Thank you. Welcome to everyone. Good afternoon. Before we begin today, let us acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, who have been stewards of this land and these waters for generations. We're grateful for their enduring care and connection to this territory, while recognizing that as settlers, we must also commit ourselves to taking meaningful action to advance reconciliation and recognition of Indigenous rights. In alignment with the focus of this speaker series on evaluating excellence, I look forward to us continuing to strive towards understanding and incorporating Indigenous perspectives in our work, fostering meaningful partnerships with Indigenous communities, and doing the work to educate ourselves and others about the rich heritage, cultural heritage of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation and other Indigenous nations. The reform of academic assessment can offer important steps in the broader collective journey towards reconciliation, fostering a more inclusive and harmonious future for all on these ancestral lands. So welcome to the second event of the series, Evaluating Excellence, Rethinking Approaches to Academic Assessment. This series is a joint initiative of the OVPRGS and the Office of the Provost and Vice President Academic. It's supported by funding from an EDI stipend from the Canada Research Chairs Programme. I'd like to acknowledge and give special thanks to Holly Nazar, Loredani Carboni, Prem Suryakamur, and others from the OOR for making today's event happen. The series is really a response to a growing international movement that's calling on us to rethink academic assessment, how we define success, who and what we value, and what informs our academic practices and culture. This series is also a more particular response to the recommendation that came forward from the working group on the impact of the pandemic and on our faculty and librarians, which called for measures that would recognize and value the full range of activities that comprise academic life. The series also offers up an opportunity to take up many of the themes identified in the 17 Rooms exercise led by Jason Enns last year as part of Concordia's commitment to the UN SDGs. So the first event in the series was November 16th. Feels like yesterday, but and that was when Giovanna Lima she's an impact officer with the Erasmus University of Rotterdam, presented a fabulous talk and workshop introducing us to the researcher impact framework that she and her colleagues have developed to build evidence-based impact narratives. Following today's exciting event, which we're all looking forward to, the next event is February 12th, which will focus on open science, and we're looking forward to having Kelly Kobe with us for that. Kelly is a scientist at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute. She leads a program in meta-research and open science and is the newly minted co-chair of DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment. That event will be a convo with Nicola Alessandroni, who's a postdoc working with Christa Byers-Heinlein, and really the force behind Concordia's working group on open science. Two final events are still at the planning stage. one of which will address Indigenous transformations within the academy. And really the intention of the Evaluating Excellence speaker series is to bring rich and informed perspectives and expertise to Concordia, offering opportunities for us to gain insights into the rapidly shifting landscape of assessment and to inform our rethinking and reform processes. So I'll hand you over to our moderator for today and much of the series, Dr. Tanja Tajmel, who's a prof in the Center for Engineering and Society and a Concordia University Research Chair in EDI in STEM. And yeah, thank you. Thanks, Tanja.
Thank you. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Douglas, for introducing. It's my pleasure to be here today, and I'm now sharing with you the agenda of today briefly, and then it will be my distinct pleasure to introduce the speaker to you. So there will be an introduction and a welcome of the Vice President Research and Graduate Studies, Dominique Berubet, who will share the institutional alignment and will also talk to you about why this topic matters to Concordia and to universities and to academia. Then there will be the presentation of our speaker, Dr. Vincent Larivière, from around 35 to 40 minutes. Then we will have plenty of time for question and answers, 40 minutes. So please take notes, reserve your questions, and then we have plenty of time to discuss them. And after that, I think the event will end around 1:45 to 2 p.m. We will also have a wrap-up and a conclusion and a call to action of this event. Now, before I'm giving the floor to our Vice President, it's my pleasure to introduce you, Dr. Vincent Larivière. He is UNESCO Chair in Open Science and full Professor of Information Science at the École de Bibliotéconomie et des Sciences de l'Information at Université de Montréal, where he teaches research methods and bibliometrics. He is also Scientific Director of the Erudit Journal Platform and Associate Scientific Director of the Observatoire des Sciences et des Technologies. Furthermore, Vincent has also a role in higher administration as Vice Rector of Strategic Planning and Communications at Université de Montréal and a regular member of the Centre interuniversitaire de recherche sur la science et la technologie. From 2013 to 2023, he was Canada Research Chair on the transformations of scholarly communication. Among his recent publications, and there are many, is the book Equity for Women in Science, Dismantling Systemic Barriers to Advancement, which he published and co-authored together with Cassidy Sugimoto in 2023. And I would also like to mention another publication, a very recent one in December 2023, published in Scientometrics, together with Fei Xu, on oligopoly of open access publishing. Maybe you can also speak to that, which is about who are the big winners of open access publishing. So very interesting. Today, informed by his extensive record of research on bibliometrics and scientometrics, Dr. Larivière will discuss key concerns and challenges associated with some metrics that are heavily used in researcher evaluation, such as the journal impact factor and the H-index. And in his talk, he will address questions like, how objective are such metrics? Do they advantage some groups over others? What are the implications of using journal impact factor and H-index for open science? What are the implications for decolonizing academic research? And what are the implications for equity, diversity, and inclusion? Okay, so now I'm giving the floor to our Vice President for Research and Graduate Studies, Dominique.
Thanks, Tanja. Thank you so much. I won't take too much of your time this morning. Really an honor to be here, of course, to open. Vincent is a long-time friend, or I don't know how to say it. Anyway, been friend for a long time. discussing these questions, and we had many opportunities to debate and to discuss these questions before. I think that within university leadership and within each department and for each faculty, that question of bibliometrics and how they are used in the progress of your careers and how they are used in establishing what is excellence and who is getting research funding and who is not getting research funding is driving a lot of your career, but are also the anxiety that is related to the faculty career in general. And I think that university leadership in general is preoccupied by that also. I would say in each university in terms of how we can manage to expand our understanding of what is research excellence, how to use bibliometrics and all these indicators, because I think it's obvious that we're not going to get rid of these indicators and bibliometrics, that we need them, but that they need to be always used and seen and interpreted in the context of what we're trying to do. And I think that's the importance of what the international declaration, of research assessments, such as DORA and the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, is also trying to explain and to sort of convey to the communities that it's not to eradicate these questions. We struggle too much to define indicators of what is research impact, that we cannot afford, I think, to get rid of these indicators. We need to use them smartly. And I think that's exactly why the work that Vincent is doing is so important, because he shows us the behinds of these indicators, what they mean, how they're calculated, what is the impact for different groups, how we can use that, how we should not use them, in fact, and to make sure so that we're smarter. And I really like what Monica said a bit earlier, saying that we need to educate ourselves to be able to make those decisions and to move forward. So that's super important for Concordia. Concordia, of course, has a long leadership in terms of putting forward initiatives that is trying to recognize and integrate and include, to be more inclusive of all different scholarships within the institution. And there's many initiatives, for example, led by the Provost Office around accessibility, equity, decolonization. We've got the recommendations from the working group on open science, which were really clear also about how we can expand our understanding of research excellence. And I should talk also about the project that is being led by Monica around the impact pathways, and that exactly is trying to do that, recognize the diversity of the research pathways and excellence. And so all these commitments that we're trying to develop at Concordia and commit to, in fact, is driven by these questions, of how are we going to evolve our understanding of research excellence and how can we better do it within Concordia. So that's really great to have that conference today. One of the things, that I forgot to mention is that I think Concordia is really keen on signing on the DORA agreement. And initially, when the DORA was launched and everything, everybody signed in. Sort of everybody jumped into the wagon and signed the agreement. I don't know if you call it an agreement, but at least to the committed to it. And the more they went about it, the more they started to communicate. The organization started to communicate, okay, but what are you doing to implement DORA? So I think c'est vraiment un bon point. The code and values of Concordia are really clear, and that's saying, no, we're not going to sign until we know and we can see what we're going to do to really make a difference and implement it. So that's definitely that speaker series is sort of part of that movement. And really hopeful that we can, during the spring, formalize our commitment to DORA with everything that we're going to be trying to put in place. So, thank you so much, Vincent, pour être ici aujourd'hui, se joindre à Concordia, faire cette présentation, bien sûr. Thank you to our moderator, Tanja Tajmel, to do that job also and bringing that perspective of equity in the discussion. And with that, I hope that you enjoy the talk and everybody has the opportunity to engage and contribute on this topic. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. I will be standing up because I hate talking while being seated. And I'll be happy to answer anything about DORA because to answer Dominique's question, it's a declaration. So you declare that you're going to join the principle. It doesn't mean that you're going to actually do the thing that is the hardest. Okay, so I've got quite an ambitious set of slides today that hopefully I'll be able to go through, but I don't think it's going to be the case. So here's the plan. So I want to talk about the changing role of scholarly publishing in the ecosystem. Then we're going to talk about 3 different aspects that are related to equity and bibliometrics. First, how open access plays a role and how various incentives that we're creating are leading to inequities in the system. Then we're going to talk about limitation of citation indicators and of bibliometric indicators in general. I'm going to focus indeed on the H-index and impact factor, but also talk about basic citation indicators. Because if you think about DORA, DORA is against impact factors. It's not against bibliometrics. So it actually targets a very narrow aspect of the entire research evaluation portfolio. And I think it's an important one, but there's also other issues in the system. Then we're going to talk about consequences for equity, mostly from a gender, but also from a, let's say, other types of socio-demographic data that we can get. And then we're going to conclude about how can we ethically publish and evaluate researchers. What should we be doing as a community to create an evaluation, let's say, framework that actually is good for scientists, but also good for society in general. So, changing role of scholarly publishing. So, I think you all know that, but publishing is increasingly important, but we need not to go too far in the past to, let's say, live in a different world. So nowadays, if you're a lab or you don't publish, it's as if you were doing nothing. So the act of researching itself doesn't have the same value anymore. A few decades ago, you would be working on your thing and it would be fine. Now, if you are not publishing, if your lab has a 1 year or 2 year gap in publication, hey, what's happening with you, Vincent? Are you sick? Is there something happening? You need to publish as a signal to the community that you're actually existing. Of course, it leads to an increase in researchers' productivity. You cannot compare CVs of researchers from a few decades ago with people of the same age today. And it's actually very interesting to contrast that with Peter Higgs. So you probably know the Higgs boson. So the Higgs boson is a theoretical construction by Peter Higgs, which was empirically measured about a decade ago. But Higgs stopped publishing in 1979. He considered that he had done his theoretical contribution that, well, like I think I'm done with science. I can still advise students. I can still go to conferences, ask questions, and be part of the scientific community, review manuscripts, teach. But I'm done with publishing. And that reminds us that one does not win the Nobel Prize, cures cancer, or does a massive change to science and society by publishing 5,000 papers. You actually need only one important discovery to change the face of the world. So we're kind of putting an increased emphasis on that, and I think that leads to actually more adverse effects than good things. And of course, the context of that is the fact that many universities, many governments have put bibliometrics at the center of their research evaluation systems. Some countries have done it more than others. So you may know the Chinese case, where basically in order to get your PhD in most universities, you need to publish 2 papers in English in an American journal. Or if you publish in Science or Nature, it actually gives you, well, actually it's the case for almost all journals, but Science and Nature are kind of the pinnacle of the economic aspect. So if you publish a paper in Science and Nature, it can give you a bonus of about $150,000. So they monetized publishing, and so that, of course, leads to an increased pressure, both on researchers, but also on the entire, let's say, scientific ecosystem. And of course, the international context here is the fact that all rankings are bibliometric based. Some of them have a higher proportion, some of them have a lower proportion. But in the race for students, and mostly for international students, these rankings matters, and they're tied to revenues for institutions. So researchers are publishing more and more. We can debate whether they are actually discovering more. There's probably an argument to be made that per paper published, there's probably less science underneath it. So just to give you an idea of the numbers So that's just a trend since the 1980 of the annual number of papers published at the world level. And the three little dots that you see on the right are actually the 3 pandemic years. So for the 3 years where actually labs were closed, let's say there was an issue with just the capacity that we had to do science, we managed to publish almost 1 million more papers than the previous years. So that means that, again, at the world level, about 7 million papers. At the individual level, we, as I said, we see the same thing. People with who just have their PhD already contributed to 20 or 30 papers, which, of course, is a bit crazy. So we are publishing more and more. That, of course, has consequences on who controls what we publish. So a publisher like Elsevier, for instance, is very happy with the race for publications because it leads them to, you want to publish? Sure, we're going to create more journals, which is going to lead to more subscription revenues. We're going to also be in favor of open access so that you can actually pay article processing fees. But what's quite striking is that 25 years ago when the internet was created, there was a view that actually Elsevier would disappear because we would not need them anymore. And so that's from Forbes magazine. So the web was created to bring academics together. Now it offered them a way of sharing their research online for free. Why would someone need journals anymore? So as you all know, Forbes was wrong. Well, they're probably wrong on other aspects too, but on that one, they were they were totally wrong. And so this has consequences. And so by playing with bibliometric indicators, it also means that we're actually spending more money on subscription because that's going to be pushed by publishers. Just to give you an idea of how much our outputs are actually controlled by those publishers. And it's quite crazy, both in the social sciences and in the natural and medical sciences. So that's basically the proportion of papers that are controlled by these mostly for-profit publishers. So in the natural sciences, Elsevier, Springer, and Wiley control half of the market. So half of the things that we submit and publish and evaluate for free is actually controlled by these corporations. And we see a similar trend in the social sciences and humanities, where instead of being 3 for-profits, it's actually 5 corporate publishers. And so we don't own, in that entire publishing system, we don't own the output, and we're being actually sold that at very, very high amount, which of course leads, and I won't talk about a lot of money. I don't like to talk about money in public, but I think we have no choice in that case. With a profit margin of about 40%, more or less. So of course, there's not a lot of companies who have these profit margins. Car companies have profit margins of 4, 5, 6%, of course, because they actually have to pay for the primary material, which Elsevier does not have to, and also have to pay their employees, which Elsevier doesn't really have to. So about 40% of profit out of academia is something that we can debate, which is a good thing. And I think this is not, as I mentioned, unrelated to research evaluation. This entire research evaluation complex pushes us towards for-profit publishers, as well as predatory publishers. You can ask questions on that later. I have slides, but they're outside my 75 slides that we have for today. Okay, so in this entire ecosystem, we need to talk a bit about open access and how it can actually lead to higher equity. So open access is relatively recent. I'll go fast on that. It's a creation of the digital age. Physicists were the first to actually start publishing openly with the archive ePrint server more than 30 years ago. And they also started 30 years ago to kind of stop caring about peer review, which is something that we probably also need to have a discussion on at some point. So in particle physics and astronomy, basically almost 100% of research is freely open. It's not the case in all fields. Physicists were kind of alone for about a decade until the Budapest Open Access Initiative kind of crystallized what open access was, which I'm going to just take the simple definition. It means that we need to give immediate access to the peer-reviewed papers that we collectively publish, which is, again, a principle that I think all scientists would agree with. The thing is that starting with Budapest, there was a reappropriation of what open access was. by for-profit publishers, which then said, oh, of course, we're in favor of openness, but of course, you need to pay, which is when they kind of define the concept of gold open access. And gold open access can mean many things. Sometimes it's free for authors, so authors don't have to pay to publish, and also readers don't have to pay. So the entire journal is either funded by a society or it's funded by the government. But also sometimes there's a free for the author. And there we need to be very careful about where we put our chips. There's non-profit editors that actually charge an amount. But there's also for-profit publishers that charge an amount. And typically the for-profit publishers are going to charge twice or 3 times or even more what non-profit will charge. Keep in mind the 40% profit margin. If, again, it takes the same amount of time to produce a paper, you want a 40% profit margin, it's going to be higher. So again, Springer, Elsevier, Wiley are at about 3,000 apiece to publish a paper. Then, if you're lucky enough to be accepted in Nature, it's going to be around 9,500 euros, which is about 13 to 14,000 Canadian dollars. You had a choice between buying a small car, where workers were actually paid, or publish Nature. And I know you will all choose Nature, but maybe you can you can reconsider. But it again shows the monetization and actually the direct relationship between the journal impact factor of a journal and the amount that's going to be charged by these publishers. So this is something we can debate whether it's actually the right way of making science more equitable. So in parallel with that, you have the physicist way of doing things, which is to take the final version of your paper and put it on the institutional repository or in a disciplinary repository. And this is something that can be done for free. Actually, the vast majority of publishers allow it. So again, about 85%, now we're probably closer to 90%, let you do that. So your paper is accepted by a Wiley journal, you put it on the repository. And quite strikingly, some of the publishers that are the most against this way of doing are actually scientific society. So the American Chemical Society and IEEE are actually pushing hard against self-archiving, which is a bit depressing, I must say. But for most fields and for most publishers, this is actually the right way of disseminating in open access without having any financial barriers, both for authors as well as for readers. And also, if I may say, from a militant point of view, it kind of recalibrates I'd say the forces between researchers and various publishers. Now, how much open access is out there? Are we actually doing it collectively to disseminate our work to the entire society? Well, physicists are still I would say the good child of academia, with overall about 70%-ish of their papers that are in open access. Biological science, still pretty good, math, and then you see at the other end of the spectrum, mostly social sciences and humanities, as well as engineering. So in arts, philosophy, history, we're at about 20% open access. Of course, we need to understand that the dissemination ecosystem is a bit different in those fields. There's a huge part that comprises of books, as well as of small publishers that actually need revenue. So this is where we need to be a bit careful about not seeing at least the science way of open access and trying to apply it to all disciplines. We need to be a bit more careful about how to do it. But we see that engineering and management and chemistry are probably places where there's a sweet spot. Now at the Canadian level, we mostly like to think that Canada is an example on these types of things. I will use the French word because I don't know what the English word is, and maybe then I would make an impair. Canada is a cancre. So Canada is terrible from an open access point of view. We created some of the first mandates, so funders created mandates for scientists to disseminate in open access without any monitoring at all of whether we were collectively doing it, and we're not. And Concordia is among the worst of the worst. So that's just the trend for Canadian universities. My institution, actually my two institutions are first and second. No conflict of interest here. And Concordia, along with Polytechnic and Ryerson, are at the bottom. What's the common denominator here? Engineering, basically. So of course, the institution is active in fields that have very low open access rates. In the case of UQAM and Université de Montréal, the higher rank are mostly due to the Érudit Journal platform, which disseminates about 100% in open access, mostly in social sciences and humanities in French. So there's a kind of a language gap actually in Canada where French language literature is much more likely to be open access than English language literature. But just within G7 countries, we're last. The British have around 80% open access. The Americans are probably at 70%. We're at about a paper out of 2 that is in open access. And mostly because, and again, it's not a infrastructure thing. It's mostly monitoring. Like there's no, research councils are not looking at us at all, so we're not doing it. Which of course leads to issues for our, in terms of accessibility, but also in terms of our own visibility as researchers. Just 2 points about why open access is the way to go for equity. That map shows the proportion of references that are made to open access literature by country. So the redder the country, the higher that country cites what's open. And why do they cite more things that are open? It's because they cannot subscribe to the journals. So at Université de Montréal, the budget for journals is about 7 million a year. McGill is at, I think, something like 15, Toronto at 20-ish. And at UDEM, we're not able to subscribe to everything. So if we're not, most institutions in the South or in Asia are not able. So if you want to have a global impact, your papers need to be open. Our papers need to be collectively open. But what's good collectively is also good individually. So we're going to actually destroy citation indicators, but let's believe in them for a second. No, that's not true. I won't destroy them, just some of them. I'm going to be charitable. But OK, open access papers are more cited because they draw on a larger pool of citers. So there's both a collective advantage to disseminating in open access as well as individual advantages. So that's something that we can work on. OK, now let's move to something that is slightly more contemporary and that looks at 2 threats that we have in, I would say, on Earth right now. COVID and climate change. So you may remember about, well, I think it was now 4 years ago, so the first few weeks of the pandemic where the scientific community is like, OK, we need to open science because this is something important and we need to make sure that our data is open, our papers are open, we need to do open peer review so that we have access to the science now. It worked. Papers that are COVID related were actually opened by publishers and the science was done. So that's a short-term emergency. Now let's compare that with climate change, which is a long-term emergency, which is, I believe, slightly more threatening than COVID. In terms of climate change, we are not doing it. And you see all of the SDGs here? We are not doing it for any of the SDGs. The SDGs are among the less open science that we are collectively publishing, which makes absolutely no sense. Now let's compare open access papers for our top 3 publishers that we mentioned earlier, so Wiley, Springer, and Elsevier. When it comes to COVID papers, indeed, they have opened everything, and actually much more than the rest of the publishers, the other 50% of papers. Now, if you look at climate change papers, they are less open than the rest of the publishers. So again, taking Elsevier as an example, around 30% of climate change papers that they publish are closed. So there's something here where we need to also focus our, let's say, mobilizations, on topics that have collective importance. Which brings me to citation indicators. So I've been working on those things for about 25 years. And when I was talking about the journal impact factors to group in the late 1990s, no one knew what I was talking about. There was some obscure faculty at the back of the room saying, yeah, I've heard about those things once, but. And now when I talk about journal impact factors, undergraduate students would know what it is. And master's students, actually undergrad students know what it is, but it's something that is a bit obscure, a bit like a wizard-ish type of, but master's students know what it is and believe in it. And I think it's very frightening because we should not think about those things when we do science. We should actually focus on doing the best science, and we should not care about all of those things. So what do citations measure? And there's still dozens of essays every year that try to come up with an answer to that. What they measure is definitely not quality. What they measure is some form of impact on other researchers. And we'll try to get to what it actually measures. So first element is that citations cannot be compared across disciplines. If you are in cancer research, the community you're speaking to is very large and publishes a lot. Therefore, your expected citations are going to be much higher than if you work in optics or if you work in social sciences. If you publish a paper now, also, it still has 0 citations. So it takes time for citations to accumulate. Citations cannot replace peer review. There's a moderate correlation. When you look at groups and what peer review evaluation shows and what bibliometric indicators show, there's going to be a relation, but it's going to be a very moderate one, not to say a weak one. And the last point that I need to emphasize again, just in terms of generalities on citations, is that for every unit, every group, every country, you're going to see that the majority of papers have very little citations. And that averages of citations, the numbers that you're going to get for any unit are going to be based on a few papers that have received relatively higher citation rates. So these distributions are skewed, so there's not a typical citation rate of a paper. The typical citation rate is very low, but then there's random elements that lead to some of them being more cited. So what are the factors that actually lead to higher citation rates? So I want to go through a few general considerations on citation which don't necessarily discredit them, but I think allows us to have a more fine grain of understanding of what they mean and why we as researchers cite and what that means for using them in terms of impact indicators. So the first element is that we're actually self-citing. Can I have an impact on myself? Hopefully I have, but it's not the same as having impact on others. The likelihood that I'm going to self-cite myself varies a lot as a function of my career age. And so on that, and this is a bit technical, but bear with me for a moment. I'm making a distinction between the proportion of self-references and the proportion of self-citations. The proportion of self-references is taking all of the references list in my own paper. So of all of the things that I cite, what is the space that I'm giving to my own papers? Proportion of self-citations is, of all of the citations I've received, what part am I responsible for? If you look at the proportion of self-references, when you start your career, that's the orange line. How high are your self-references? Very low, because you've not published yet. So the more you publish, the more you draw on your previous work, and then these percentages increase. So what this suggests from a self-references point of view is that these self-references are mostly a normal feature of career progression. In terms of self-citations, when you start your career, again, that's the blue line, who knows about you? You, mostly. So of course, you're going to have a higher rate of those, and then as you age, it kind of goes down. So what this figure shows actually is that self-citations at the aggregate level are not so much a problem. There are indeed faculty and maybe colleagues who are heavy self-citers, but in general, most researchers are actually honest in their citation behavior, and they're self-citing because they're drawing on their previous work. Going back to our general slide here, I want to say a few words on where we cite papers. And this is, I think, important to understand how these citation numbers are actually aggregated. So what this figure shows is, on the x-axis, is the progression of a scientific paper to the beginning of the intro until the end of the conclusion. Where are citations located? They're almost all in the introduction, which means that they're, I'll say the word, probably slightly superficial. You're just mentioning to actually signal to your readers, and mostly to the referees, that you know what you're talking about. And most highly cited papers, where do you think they're cited? In the intro. In order to talk about this topic, you need to cite Berube 2023. That's the paper. She's the VP also, but you have no choice, you see? So that kind of suggests that in the aggregate, most of these citations actually come for it's a very specific purpose of citation. Then, of course, at the end of the paper, you see, it kind of goes up again. These are the papers you actually engage with. These are the papers that you compare your results with. So right now, citation data are binary. Do you cite that paper or not? But we need to move toward, and there's a few databases that are doing it now, to move a bit more to the citation context, or at least the place where you're cited. How engagement is there with your paper? Are you just cited because you've already been cited, so it's a pure Matthew effect, or you're actually cited because you're contributing to today's science? A few words about uncitedness, and this is something that I hate to hear, but I'm hearing it all the time. Most research is bogus. We don't use paper. We see ear students saying that a lot. No one will read my thesis. And most research is cited. Most of the papers that we're collectively writing are used, and even by others, not only by us. The only thing is that it takes time, as I mentioned earlier, for citations to accumulate. And so just focus on the medical sciences, which is a green line there. About almost 90% of papers get cited at some point. So of course there's a residual, but globally our papers are cited by others. Which brings me to negative citations, which is sometimes, we sometimes hear that as a criticism of citation indicators. So what we did for that, and I'll go quickly on the method, we had access to about 4 million papers where we extracted the citation context of references and then came up with a coding scheme to see whether the papers were negatively cited. And what we see is that, and that's the gray little line here, about 1 reference out of 300 is negatively cited. Does that mean that 299 out of 300 are actually positive? No, most of them are neutral. They're in the introduction to show that this thing exists, but there's, again, as I mentioned earlier, not a lot of engagement. Now, from a sociological point of view, what is striking there is that the level of disagreement totally follows Auguste Comte's hierarchy of discipline. So Auguste Comte, kind of the founding father of sociology, made a hierarchy of discipline from the more complex to the less complex, and from the less consensual to the more consensual. Here, by complex, it doesn't mean that it's more difficult. It just means that it's less predictable. So social sciences is actually much more complex. Humans are more complex to predict than particles. And so in such a context, researchers are much more likely to disagree than in mathematics or in physics. And this is exactly what we're seeing, about a factor of 10. But globally, from a bibliometric point of view, negative citations are not a huge problem. The problem child is the impact factor. So again, all of you probably know the impact factor. This indicator was actually created not to evaluate researchers, but to help librarians choose journals for their collection development. Then in the mid-1990s to late 1990s, they stopped using that because they were buying bundles of journals, so didn't have to choose journals anymore. And at the same time, researchers started to use that as a way to evaluate their colleagues. So the impact factor is obtained by a very simple calculation. Basically, how many times the papers published in a journal are cited over a 2-year period. So it's just a simple average over a very short period of time. That seems a bit harmless, but it has created, I believe, a lot of issues. But let's see what issues, from a technical point of view, there are with the indicators. And again, this one is a bit technical, but I'll go over it fast. Sorry about that. There's a mistake, a simple calculation mistake in the calculation of the journal impact factor. So what we're counting in the numerator are all of the citations received by any document published by the journal, and we're dividing that by only articles and review articles, which means that a journal that publishes editorials, letter to the editors, and that those are cited, those come as free citations for the journals. These corresponding documents are not in the denominator. So if you look at the right of the figure there, a journal like Science or Nature gets a 20 to 25% bonus in terms of citation because of all of the various types of documents that it publishes that are what they call non-citable items, so that are not in the denominator, but that are cited. So this creates incentives for journals to publish all sorts of things that are not articles, where they can actually self-cite their own journals and artificially increase their impact factor. So Clarivate, that's a company that builds the impact factor, created kind of an impact factor police that tracks journal and tries to find those that are cheating. And they find dozens of these journals every year, but that's the ones that we find. There's probably others that are actually going out there unpunished. And that kind of exemplifies that. We have a lot of journal level self-citation. I'll go fast on that, but it's something that exists. Crucial point. I said earlier that distributions are skewed in bibliometrics. The journal impact factor is in the same situation. So we're basing this average on just a few papers that are highly cited. So if you take the top journal here, which is Cell, it has an impact factor of 30 because it has 23 papers here that have received more than 100 citations. If you remove those, you see that the distribution is identical almost to that of Nature Chemical Biology, which has an impact factor that is half of that of Cell. So basically, outliers are making the difference here, and we're using that collective value as an indicator of the impact of every paper published in a journal, which of course makes no sense, especially when the distribution is skewed. I'm going fast on that, but don't hesitate to ask questions later if you didn't get that. I mentioned the disciplinary comparison, which again means that in China, if you work in social sciences, the cash that you can get is much smaller than if you are working in the medical fields, where impact factor can be in the few hundreds, of course. Now, an interesting effect here, which is marketing. So every year, publishers and journals are bragging that their impact factor is rising. So Elsevier does it, Wiley does it, Springer does it. The thing is that there's more and more papers published every year, therefore everyone increases. All of the impact factor are increasing. So there's nothing really to be excited about such an increase. It's a bit like global warming and the rise of seas, basically. That was not funny. Then, declining predictive power. So when the internet was created, there was an interesting effect on the relationship between the papers and the journal. So let me be a bit more precise here. In the paper era, researchers were subscribing to journals, they were receiving them, and their reading patterns were relatively narrow. It was very difficult to search over an extended back period of time, and also across several journals. And so researchers were reading the few top journals of their field. Now with Google Scholar and all of these tools, you are able to find a paper irrespective of where it is published. So what we're seeing since the beginning of the digital age is that journal matters less and less and less. So even if collectively we're giving more importance to the JIF, in our own practices, we don't follow the journals very narrowly. We actually find papers across all fields. So the relationship between the impact of the journal, which is based in the past, and the impact of the papers themselves is increasingly weak. There's a disjunction. And this is, I think, a very compelling argument where it suggests that we should not care about journals anymore. And what is true at the global level is also true at the individual level. So a journal like PNAS in the late 1980s, that journal alone was publishing about 10% of the best papers at the world level. Now it's about 3 to 4%, and it has continued to decrease. So again, there's really is a shift. The good papers are found across a much more diverse set of journals than it was in the past. Okay, we have impact factor manipulation, and then I'm almost done with the JIF. We'll see what's left of it after. not much, unfortunately, or fortunately. But this is an interesting example of the manipulation that editors can make. So this is an email that one of my colleagues in South Africa got that basically says, thank you, your paper is about to be accepted in the journal, but before it is accepted, we would request that you actually cite our journal a bit more in your cited references, which again is something that we have anecdotal evidence of. I saw something which is even worse. I saw publishers that in the PDF that they produce have embedded invisible references to the journal. So this is something that as a reader you don't see, but it's embedded in the code of the PDF, and it's caught by all of the various indices. So it looks as if the paper is not self-citing or self-citing the journal, but it is abundantly. So again, these are all things that are in the system because we're evaluating researchers based on these indicators. So there's a huge loss of time for everyone. So what's left of the journal impact factor? Of course, there's a certain relationship between the difficulty of publishing in a journal and the journal impact factor. Every field, there's a few journals that one can argue are actually slightly, at least, better than others. That said, for the long tail of journals, there's actually no difference. So let's say within a field, you're going to have 5 journals that are qualitatively different. For the rest, it doesn't mean anything. And I think we should stop averaging or calculating any of these numbers. And this is what Dora tries to fight against. And this is what I think most universities in North America are also pushing for. Which brings me to another indicator, which is actually worse. That is called the H-index. So the H-index comes from laziness. I said it. So there's a physicist who had, and he writes that in his PNAS paper, he had to evaluate candidacies for a postdoc position. And he had like 100 or a few hundred of them. And he said, there's no way I'm going to read all of these proposals, which I also understand. Point is that we probably need also to put that amount of pressure on academics, but let's close this parenthesis. So he said, I need to come up with a number that's going to allow me to rank them. So I said, okay, I'm going to come up with a single number, a single integer between basically 0 and infinite, where the value that is obtained means that that person has published at least that amount of papers that have received at least that amount of citations. So I'll say it differently. A researcher with an H-index of 10, it means that they have published at least 10 papers that each got at least 10 citations. So what does it put as an incentive for a researcher? Well, you need to publish as much as possible because your maximum H-index is your number of papers. So if you publish 2 papers that have been cited 5 million times, you're going to get an H-index of 2. But let's just compare 2 cases, Martin and Martine. Martin has 10 papers. Each of them are cited 10 times. That gives him an H-index of 10. It also gives him a citation per paper of 10. You compare that with Martine, who has a distribution of citation that is a bit different. First paper cited 100 times, 50, 50, 30. She has an H-index of 5 because she has 5 papers that have received at least 5 citations. The 6th one in order of citation didn't get 6, so it means that she stops at 5. But her citation in average by article, and just her total citation is twice as high, but her H-index is twice as small. So that number actually can mean a lot of different things. And by coming up with only one number, you're actually not gaining information. You're losing information, and you may make, let's say, unfair choices. So the H-index, I would say that in the expert community, there's a general consensus that it should never be used for 2 reasons. First, its properties from a statistical point of view don't really make sense. But also, it leads to plenty of adverse effects. So let's say that you're Martine and you're starting to be a bit more cynical. And you say, okay, I'm publishing an 11th paper. What paper should I cite in my 11th paper? Not the one that has received already 100 citations, because all of these external excedent citations are useless for the H-index. I'm going to cite that one, because that's the one that matters for an increase. And then I will actually cite all of the other ones also so that they can raise. So it leads to strategic citing. It leads to over-publishing. The amount of adverse effects is actually, one could argue, are even more worse than the impact factor. Which brings me to, and I'm almost done, consequences for equity, and mostly from a gender point of view. Bibliometric indicators in many ways embed inequalities, and that's kind of what we see at the world level. So that's a world map, and every country that is in orange, look very carefully, has gender parity. All of them. All of them have it. There's actually one. It's called Latvia, where women account for slightly higher proportion of the research community than men. Mostly because men die 10 years younger. So there's not so much policy that we can develop based on that. But basically, there's a huge gap in life expectancy, which means that men die, and then women account for a larger proportion of both the population as well as the general workforce and the scientific workforce. So about one author out of 3 is a woman, slightly less than that at the world level. More equity in South America, as well as in Eastern Europe, but again, mostly in the case of Eastern Europe because of men's life expectancy. In the case of South America, it's mostly because scientific careers are not the most well paid. If you take the case of Argentina, which is in the parity zone, most academics are actually working for free in university. So that's not something that we would like to base our policies on. So we actually we made all of these multiple regressions as well as simple regressions such as this one. And the one that was actually that had the highest relation was the gap between men and women in life expectancy, as I mentioned earlier. There's no relationship between the level of wealth of a country and the place of women in science. There's no relationship or a very weak one between the place of women in politics or in the parliament and their place in science. And so in that, we have less women, and then in the system, okay, I'll get to that later, but I'll say it now. In the system, they are disadvantaged by all of the citation indicators. All bibliometric indicators contain a gender gap, and we'll get to that later. So the situation is slightly improving, as you can see from these very clear lines. No, it is improving, but if you expand based on that, or you make predictions, we're going to reach parity in physics, chemistry, and engineering in about 2248. So yeah, that's kind of a long, so we won't be there, I'm sorry. So the situation is not improving very, very, very rapidly. So one thing that I want to mention on the citation part and the gender gap here is the fact that, as I said, women are at a disadvantage when it comes to citations. What is striking is that in general, women are able to publish in the same journals as men from an impact factor point of view, which means that they go through the same level of peer review. And so at the source, there's not as much gap, but in terms of the reception of the paper by the community, there's a huge gap. So across various disciplines, we see a citation penalty of about 10%, sometimes slightly higher, sometimes slightly lower. There's a few reasons behind that, and that's why they're at a disadvantage. First, there's a lot of network effects in citations. We know that men are more likely to cite other men, and therefore, given that there's more men in the system, that leads to their citation rates being a bit higher. There's also a huge gap in networking, let's say on the international aspects of men and women. For every country, women are more likely to have national colleagues, and men more likely to have international colleagues, which is mostly due to the different types of mobility that women have. And these international network leads to, again, higher citation rates. But another factor is self-citations. So in blue, you have the proportion of self-citations of men's papers by total citation level, and in orange, you have those of women. So again, more are self-citing, even controlling, more self-citing, controlling for other factor, which also contributes to these gender differences. So the use of bibliometric indicator has effects, as a relationship or as adverse consequences, one could say, for women. Last point I want to mention before moving to the conclusion is the influence of identity on research topics. And where I'm going with that is that the diversity of the community, this is something important because we have ideals of equity, but it also changes the type of science that we know, the type of science that we do, and the things that we know about society and natural sciences, etc. So we did an analysis for the United States. The US has very clear race categories. This is not what we have in Canada, so this is a national construct, which the Americans have. So we took 4 of them, so Asian, Black, Latinx, and white, and we managed to assign that to authors, and also to assign them a gender. And we wanted to look whether some groups were more likely to work on some topics. And what we saw was a very strong relation, a bit in health, but more so in the social sciences. So if you take the top right quadrant for Black, you see that Black women are much more likely to work on gender-based violence, learning, literacy, and much less likely to work on the stock market, among other things. So it means that who we are as a community also influences what we know. So what we did then, we said, okay, let's say that the US scientific community was representative of US society, which we know is not. Blacks are 3 times less likely to be in science, same for that. But let's say that we really equilibrate. What fields would be more studied and what fields would be less studied? And I must say, I kind of like the results. So there would be more social work, more child psychology, more public health, more fields that are actually related with common good, one could say, and much less physics engineering. I mean, I like physics and engineering, this is cool, but what I like even more is when you drill down to specific topics. So again, on the right, the fields that would have more, so learning, minorities, reading, women, children, and then we would have less economics. And finance, which we can, again, in an ideal world, we have more of everything, but there's a clear opposition here between fields that are related to common good and fields, one could say, that are related to individual good. So, to conclude, how can we publish and evaluate ethically? The first point is to separate publishing from evaluating. The act of publishing should not be related to how we evaluate our colleagues. There should be a different way to evaluate. We should publish when we have something, and we should have different way. I'm not saying that this is easy, but if we want to solve, this is the heart of it. And that would, of course, reduce the role of the journal impact factor. It would make it totally irrelevant. I didn't go into the details of that, but transparent peer review is actually an important component, especially to get rid of, one could say, superficial or bad literature. We have predatory publishers in the ecosystem that just want to publish papers to get article processing charges. Those journals are not performing peer review. If we mandate open peer review, which means I want to see what are the review reports of that paper, it actually will see how serious the paper was evaluated. Then if we want to focus on the indicators, these need to be associated with common good. Are you actually working on topics that are of collective importance? Are you making your research open? Are you taking gender into account in the type of activity that you're doing? We need to support nonprofit publishers. We need to stop feeding the beast. And we need to also be careful about why we cite. We need not to have a cynical approach to references. So on that, thank you very much for listening. I've put a few references there that talk about open access, gender, and impact factors. So happy to debate all of those things with you. Thank you very much.
very much, Vincent. That was awesome. I learned a lot. I think we all learned a lot. I have a lot of notes and a lot of questions, but I'm sure also the audience has questions, and I will first like to give the audience the chance to clarify or to ask any questions to contribute to the discussion. Okay, so who wants to start?
Just raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you.
Thank you for that. I was particularly struck by when you broke down the citations by the portions of the paper they showed up in. And I guess the psychologist in me is going to come out, and like one of my nitpicky questions is like, do we just have as many papers in the introduction as the discussion? I feel like my introduction skews more heavily to citations than the discussion, so does that sort of push it? And it could be the sort of psychology bias as we try and navigate the replication crisis, but the sort of idea of the introduction as being there to just prove I know my area of research feels like that's what got psychology into its problem. And there's way more focus now on what are these papers doing to set your theoretical foundations to make sense of what's going on. And that feels way more important than just saying, yeah, I know who does stuff in my field.
Yeah. So thanks for your question and comment. So we don't have as much detail on so we compiled a lot of macro level data on that, looking at the age of those references. And what we actually see is within the intro, it starts with very old papers. And then when it comes to the research question part of the intro, then papers are a bit more recent. Then methods are actually mostly old, which was a bit surprising. And then the papers that are cited in the discussion were the most recent ones, which is why I'm presenting it this way. And this is mostly drawn on medical research. So this is based on PLOS journals, which skews about 85% medical research with a clear typical article. But it'd be interesting to actually see that more in the social sciences. And I feel like history or philosophy would probably follow a totally different pattern.
We have another question back here.
Thanks. Thanks for the great presentation. So about decoupling evaluation from publication, I feel many of us have an intuition about it. Like, we've seen long publication lists, which actually kind of, do not check, and we can be suspicious about them. At the same time, if we take the use case of a faculty hiring committee, for instance, you see people who haven't published since they graduated from their PhD. Yeah. So it inevitably raises questions, because you're like, okay, is this person really independent? So my question is, practically speaking, do you have any advice on how to do that or how it could look like?
You cap the number of papers. So what I really like in what some agencies are doing nowadays is that you can put 5 papers in your CV, or they go with any type of short form, because there's a binary difference between publishing and not publishing over a certain period of time. Typically, we're expected to, and it makes sense, we need to publish. The thing is that, should we publish? There was a paper in Nature about 3 months ago that was talking about those who publish a paper a week, or 2 papers a week, or something like that. And this is the behavior that we've incentivized in all of our evaluation, where the CV is what only counts, and the long form of the CV. So by putting a cap on the number of papers that you can submit, makes a lot of sense. They do that in the UK. Not that I want the British research evaluation system. No one wants that. But at least there, people can submit 4 outputs, and then these outputs are peer-reviewed. They've been published already, but then you need to have a narrative. So I think we need to move from just counting, which is easy, to doing things that may take a bit more time. But and again, your question is complex, because that's basically how do we solve the crisis. We also need, if we want researchers to properly do the job of evaluation, we need to ask them to evaluate less. Or we cannot give a committee to evaluate 25 files or something like that. So I think restricting that. The other thing that funders have done, and this is a bit more tricky, is to remove journal names on the publication lists. So, of course, if I want you to find my paper, then it makes sense that the journal is there. But if it's for counting or accounting purposes, you stop the signaling associated with the impact factor, which is at odds with something that you may see in your field, where colleagues put the impact factor at the end of the reference list, which is something that makes me cry at night.
Do we have any other questions?
But I could give a longer answer but this is the tough part. And maybe the other point is that we need, as academics, to be ready to experiment. There's a lot of conservatism in the research evaluation ecosystem, because if we say that we start to change the evaluation system, it's as if we're changing the rules of the game we're all playing. When Dora was released more than a decade ago, by the way, there was a letter to the editor in Nature by a young scholar saying, hey guys, whoa, you've been telling me for 15 years that I need to do that. Now you're telling me height doesn't count anymore. We're going to evaluate you qualitatively. No. I signed up for this game, not for this other. So anyway, my point is that we need to be willing to first accept that the current rules are unfair, and then try to find ways to change them, understanding that we're collectively in good faith and trying our best and trying to find new rules that are as fair as possible or less unfair than what's currently available. And some funders are willing to do it. And I'll just give an example. In Switzerland, they started to award some of the funding randomly, okay? And this is something, randomness. No. The current funding system is random. Once you have a ball in the thing, you may get funded. Of course, when you're on a committee, the top 2 or 3 applications may be qualitatively different. Then at the bottom, indeed, there's a difference. But you have a long list of the majority of projects, and it's true also at the student level, where any of them could be funded. So they said, okay, the top, we know it, the bottom, we know it, but within that strata, instead of making an arbitrary cut, which is going to be based on what? If all projects are the same, what do you look at? You look at the CV. Who has the longest CV? Mostly men, and then you reify the inequalities that exist. So we're going to go randomly there. Of course, it leads to some people being unhappy, but in general, I think it leads to a more fair outcome. So again, being willing to experiment and try things in a humble manner.
I think there was
We have another question here.
Hi, merci beaucoup. A very good talk. You started by saying that Nobel Prizes are won by, usually more significant discoveries. What about the value of a single paper, right? So I think it's when it became systemized into having an impact factor for the journal. But our metrics now can track how a paper is cited, where it is cited. So how about looking at a single paper?
But we can do that, and this is all of the data. The issue with a single paper is that you have papers. Okay, I'll say differently. There's an asymmetry between a paper that is cited a lot and a paper that is not cited a lot, and both may be equally good. My point is that if you are very highly cited, if your paper is very highly cited, it contributed to something. The paper that is lowly cited may be a highly cited paper in the making, but it will only be 20 years from now. Of course, in the aggregate, there's not so many of these papers with delayed recognition, but these can happen. So I guess my more general point is that we need to be careful with the level of aggregation at which we're looking at things. When you're looking at an entire institution body of work, then despite the limitations of averages, you have something that is a bit more stable. When you look at a single paper, it may oscillate much more. And again, and more profoundly, one could say, is for what purpose? So if I want to make my case for tenure, it probably, sorry, I'm moving a lot. I hate to be seated. If I want to make my case for tenure, then it's something that may be useful. I'm trying to make a narrative out of the impact of the paper that I have, and then I can actually extract quotations of in the context in which I've been cited. So this is something that I think can be very useful to make a qualitative argument about a paper. But I'm much more concerned when I see people quantifying their own impact using tools like the Web of Science, or putting impact factors on their CVs, or just saying, hey, I've been cited 25. And this is something that it kind of got into the normal way of doing it. And I'll just want to make an anecdote. So I was on a tenure committee at the Quebec University a few years ago. And the colleague was told to put citation indicators. Put citation. He was not supposed to, but he was told by colleagues, you should put citation indicators. That's, people like that. The guy is in arts and humanities. Arts and humanities have very low citation rates, and they're poorly measured. And so he says, so I'm having a lot of impact because I've been cited 13 times. How can I tell you that? So no reflection on what that means or whether that would be. So again, so pushing the reflection, I would advise, be it councils of university, that one could not talk about, there should not be any numbers on those evaluations. Then of course you can look at a CV and say, that person published abundantly, but quantifying it, I think, leads to more issue. Because if you look at the number, then you don't do anything else because you feel like you have an answer. It forces a superficiality, I think, in the evaluation.
I think we have 2 questions in the chat, but before we come to that, I would like to comment on the Nobel Prize and the comparison that you did with Higgs.
Yeah.
I think we should not get the assumption that the Nobel Prizes, especially in the history, were based on the quality of work only, but that was a very gendered field, and the access to academia was very limited to many people. So you had to be in the right class, you had to have the right gender, the right color of the skin, the right language, and then you get the Nobel Prize. So therefore, it was not only the quality of work and the amount or the very few books that you've written, and they are of high quality. And I would also like to talk a little bit about Auguste Comte, but maybe later. Now we have 2 questions on the chat. Thank you, Vincent, for this wonderful presentation. Could you please expand on DORA? What are the elements you find most interesting?
Okay, DORA is having a second life now, or actually started a second life about a year ago. So. DORA is attacking something that we don't necessarily have in Quebec or in Canada. So DORA is attacking the use of the impact factor as they have in, let's say, a country like Italy or China. Like in Italy, if you don't publish in a journal that has an impact factor, it's as if you did not publish. It's not counted. So DORA is saying we need to stop to focus on those things. We don't have that here. So for an institution, so answering to your question, Dominique, you can sign DORA with your eyes closed because already Concordia, unless I'm mistaken, and it could be somewhere I haven't looked at, but maybe I don't think you're using impact factors throughout the institution at an abundant level. If so, then I'm sorry. But my point is that in Canada and in Quebec, we don't really have that compared to what other countries have. So it's an easy declaration to find, and it's a declaration of principle that Elsevier, Wiley, Springer have all signed. And still, they put the journal impact factors on each of their journals' websites. So it's something that is easy to do. It doesn't have any constraints. What I think is a bit more interesting is it's the COARA initiative, where it's to reform research evaluation more in depth. Because DORA doesn't say anything about about H-indices. DORA just says, stop looking at the journal. Yeah, okay, we're done looking at the journal, then we need to do something better than that, which is not to use H-indices. So my point is that, to answer this question, what do I find the most interesting? I could say from a cynical point of view is that I find it surprising that people are still excited about it, because it's something that we should be collectively past. And there's other but again, it's the thing with declaration. They're just, yeah, sure, we'll do it, but does it actually change the practices? We need to go much more further than that.
Second question, fascinating to explore bibliometrics with you, Vincent, merci. Would you discuss trends of large number of authors listed on papers that report results from a large and complex scientific project? So we know all these big, especially physics atlas experiment, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but we need to distinguish the ATLAS and the CERN experiments where there's thousands of authors on papers, which means that everyone has the same CV, by the way. You're part of that experiment, you sign every paper, so we're all part of the same group. And the goal there is we need to look as a unit to convince government to give billions of dollars to basic research. So this is a very peculiar field. What is more interesting, I believe, are the trends in medical sciences, where there's 15, 20 authors per paper on average, and it leads to issues of both measurement, but also in terms of accountability. If there's an issue with the data, if there's some fraud going on, who's responsible for that? So more and more journals are moving to the contributorship model, which I think is part of the solution, where you're at the end of the paper, you actually know who did what. So the credit taxonomy has 14 categories of contributions, from data collection to performing experiments, to writing the first draft, to correcting typos, stuff like that. And this leads to, I think, a much more transparent authorship element. Then what we need to push further is not only having these criteria, but also having authorship guidelines. So who should be an author and who should not be an author. And these things are a bit more complex because different fields have different ways of recognizing authorship, but at least transparency as to who did what to be on a paper is actually, I think, quite welcome. Now, it leads to different types of measurements, so we're able to see who are the best technicians or stuff like that, but I think it's not so interesting, to be honest, that part.
Okay, thank you. Now the next question, what about the role of social impact? For example, changes in society. What role should this play?
I think it's a crucial role, but it's a thing that cannot be measured. So it can be assessed qualitatively. So you may have heard about something called Twitter. It changed names recently with a new ownership under new management. Anyways, so when science started to be disseminated on Twitter, there were a few social scientists that thought that, now that we can track papers on Twitter, we'll be able to measure social impact, whether the science that's been published will actually impact society. What we're seeing is that's not how it works. So there is some science indeed on Twitter, but who cites your paper in the Canadian Journal of Physics? Well, it's going to be other scientists. So it's basically a scientific-ish discussion that's happening on the platform. So we don't have good tools so far to measure social impact. There's ways to measure impact in policy documents. So we do have databases where you say, those papers are cited in policy documents, but I would say the volume of scientific papers that are cited in there is actually quite small. So this is something that there's a lot of research on, but for which we don't have yet good indicators. And most of these indicators reify the biases that I mentioned earlier in terms of scientific impact. So I think these things right now are much better studied qualitatively.
Okay, so I would like to talk a little bit about equity.
Good.
Yeah, and it was very interesting how the data that you presented about equity on citing and how developing countries are citing more open access.
Yeah.
Is there any chance that, or what would you suggest that other countries are citing more work from developing countries?
Yeah.
Because that is also a question of equity.
Totally.
Maybe they don't have access because they have to pay a lot of money to publish open access.
That's a very good point. So one of my students actually did his master's thesis on that. And again, the APC route leads to now people have access to the papers, but people cannot publish because they cannot pay. So the problem, the corporate problem, corporate control of publishing leads to actually more problems than solutions. So there's a few issues there that we need to discuss. In terms of many journals in Africa are not online yet. So there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of making sure that the science that's published there is actually disseminated on the world. So there's a platform that's called Africa Journals Online, but it only accounts for a tiny proportion of the journals that are being published there. The second point on there, and I mentioned it in the conclusion about citation equality, there's or reflexive citation practices. There's an initiative from neuroscientists where basically you can put your paper there and see how diverse your pool of references is. So are you only drawing on American papers in your own papers? Or are you drawing only on men's papers? Or you're actually going to, let's say, a more diverse pool of papers published in different places? And of course, according to some people, this is the wrong way of citing, because you should only cite the best science, right? You should only cite the science that supports your claim. But I think that's a very naive way of seeing the act of citing. If you see it from a sociological point of view, you cite to convince your readers, your referees of an argument. But also, if you are reflexive and understand that these citations are also a way to give visibility to people, then I think trying to diversify the people and the places that you're citing actually makes sense. So there's tools that are being created for us to actually be more, let's say, active on that front. But then it means that the meaning of citations will change. Historically, citations were considered as indicator of research impact. Now it's going to, I believe, mean something else, which may be a good thing, and we may stop using them, hopefully, maybe in the near future.
Okay. Yeah, very interesting. Another question.
Yeah.
About the identity, and you showed very nicely who is publishing on which topics. Yeah. Isn't that also a kind of an indicator which spaces are open to which kind of identities? So, for example, you mentioned the black woman in the US publishing on black women, because maybe that's the only space where she has a position, right? Where she can get a position.
Totally.
So
it's not only, but it's topic choice. That it's a crucial point, actually. It's both topic choice, but topic choice is mediated by who accepts you, let's say, in the group. So if you take a field like philosophy, it probably skews 80% or 90% white male. And then you have the diversity of but there's totally, so you're right, you said it better than I said it.
So we should not be too quick to interpret who is interested in which topic. Rather, who has access to which field of research. Yeah.
But it's an interesting distinction. So my point is more on the what do we know about what, rather than the point that you made. But yeah. So the mechanism that you're describing explains kind of the outcome. So making physics more accessible to different groups would lead quite likely to different topics. And actually the slide for physics shows an alignment between topics. People who say, oh no, physics is a international field, and it's a field where who you are should not change or does not change what you're studying. And no, it actually shows a relationship. Of course, it's less socially charged, but we see that groups are working on topics that are different as a function of their identities.
I think it's historically very much charged. We saw it in the hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
Alone speaking of hierarchies of sciences is actually already a charging of
totally.
How masculinity is related to engineering.
You mean the Auguste Comte? Totally,
exactly,
I agree.
Exactly.
I agree. Yeah.
I think there was a question of
in the
Emma.
back,
Yeah.
Sorry, I can speak, but I'm not.
We hear you, but I'm not sure if the...
Our lovely folks on Zoom need you to use the mic.
Thank you so much. So I'm coming from, I guess, the engineering side of the world. And I wanted to get your opinion, Vincent, in specific areas like AI, for example. There is a speed issue. And what we're seeing is that there's a lot of people who are choosing to publish in ArcSiv simply to get things out quicker because it becomes very, very competitive.
Yeah.
And I would say that there's even some geopolitics that play there as well. So I wanted to get your opinion about that kind of publishing and the other aspect as well. I'm going to ask a 2-for-1, but feel free to ignore it, is the publication of data sets. So that also is slightly different. but again, can play a huge competitive advantage in certain areas. So I wanted to get your opinion about that.
Thanks for that. So I'm a big fan of archive, and I think what particle physicists have done is something that we should emulate. So when I see that AI goes in this direction, I'm actually quite in favor of it. I'm not too concerned about peer review, actually. So some of you may still believe in peer review. I'm starting to have my doubts about whether there's actually more adverse effects than good things. And there was actually an amazing experiment almost a decade ago made by the British Medical Journal, where they basically sent an abstract that contained 8 factual mistakes, okay, like something that anyone would have, and they sent that to 600 reviewers, asking them whether they should consider that piece. No one found the 8 mistakes. The max found was 5. And the majority were saying, yeah, this is good to go. Yeah, just correct this tiny typo, and it's going to be accepted. So as a good medical doctors who are used to making experiments and choosing drugs to go on the market, they say, well, with what we see here, we see that peer review basically does not work. So we have no evidence that it works, but we also actually have evidence that it has adverse effects. So if peer review was a drug, it would not go on the market. So in general, I'm in favor of that, especially for AI that, well, indeed, things go fast. And archive is public, which means that actually everyone can read. So our colleague, Yoshua Benjiu at Université de Montréal, only puts his thing in there, and I think it's great. And it also means that he cannot be measured bibliometrically because archive is not well covered, which I think is also great for him. Now moving to the sharing of data set, I think this is crucial. I think it should be there, especially for AI. The issue is that it's generally not there. And there's something else there which is related, is that in those fields, what are the organizations that have the best data sets? Is it universities or industries now? It's industries. Who knows the most things about our lives? It's not people who do a survey by calling you on the phone, like it used to be 25 years ago. It's Facebook, it's Twitter. And all of these data are private, and a lot of the research that they do is not being published. So I think that's an orthogonal problem to what you're mentioning, but I think it's a crucial one, because who knows the most right now about Canadian or US society? It's not us as scientists. It's going to be these firms. So I believe that there should be open data mandates. So if you are publishing on these topics, the data should be there. Now, and I'm sorry it's a long answer, open data doesn't have a one-size-fits-all aspect, just like open access, roughly, because open data has sensitive aspects. So when I was trained in the social sciences a few decades ago, we had to destroy our data to protect anonymity. So there's a huge clash between today's values and the values that we had in the past. So there's a lot of work to be done on data sharing, and those are not technical. They're sociological and organizational, and they're related also to incentives. If you spend 1 year collecting a data set, you don't want to lose your competitive advantage and disseminate everything once your first paper is out. But we need to make sure that you have the proper incentives to do so, and that you're recognized or rewarded in some way for being a proper scientist. This is, again, sorry, a long answer, but it's a rich question.
We have another question here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vincent, for this very interesting presentation and discussion. My question is about the AI, but not from the engineering perspective, but from a user perspective. Mm-hmm. We have more and more colleagues using AI-based tools to write the paper, to do the literature review, to analyze data. So do you believe that this new trend, maybe switch, will have an impact on your findings?
Thanks for the question. Your questions were all good, actually, so it's not a personal thank, it's to all of you. No, because then you create inequalities. Okay. Now, this one is a tough one. Okay, I'll preface by saying that AI can help us find things that we do not think about. And therefore, it can allow us to know more about society, science, and probably solve problems, cure diseases, and stuff like that. So this is great. All of that would have little consequences if we were not evaluating researchers by the number of papers that they publish. Because then we kind of reify these inequalities. And we know of colleagues, and some of them were in the news, where they use AI just to publish more. Not necessarily to do better, but to publish more. And I think this is where it leads to a problem. And why do they want to publish more? It's not because they want to discover more. It's because they want to have longer CVs, etc. So again, the nut of the problem kind of remains the same. But then there's no doubt that it can be used. So I was sitting on a committee in Ottawa a few months ago that kind of tried to put balise, kind of structure the use of AI in grant writing and grant evaluating. And I must say that I felt a bit odd because I don't think that we should allow it, at least not for evaluating. Evaluating a grant should be purely based on other scientists. Then in terms of writing, it's a bit bad. Okay, I can see that it can lead to hypotheses, but then the key thing there is to be transparent. Was there a use of AI, what algorithm, and kind of coming up with the ideas. But again, now in French, we say le dentifrice est sorti du tube, et c'est très difficile de le remettre dedans. So the genie is out of the bottle. But in French, we use a toothpaste analogy, which I think is more funny. So it's very difficult to put it back. And different countries will have different rules, which in the end will lead to inequalities in the capacity of a scientist or a country to do research, because there's no doubt that these things are going to change the face of what we know. We just need to try to mitigate the collective adverse effects.
I was wondering if you could jump back to the multi-author question from an equity perspective in particular. And there seems to be pretty compelling evidence that men are more likely to be included as authors on papers than women for equal contributions. And does something like tracking authorship contribution more closely help to level this playing field? Or multi-author papers seem to be a bit of a bigger problem given you have this gray zone?
Yeah, so you're right on the fact. So when you look at contributorship statements and you look at how many things women have done on a paper versus what men have done, you see that women typically have done more, but also they've done tasks that take more time. So more are more likely to do supervision, contribute funding, and contribute reagents. Women are more likely to having written the paper, okay, and perform the experiments. So again, indeed, so I like this transparency, but so far, I must say that the transparency has not led to rebalancing. It has led to, yeah, look, I did one contribution, so I should be an author. You see, it's just that, so, and maybe just as a general comment, I don't think we solve the measurement crisis by more measurement. Okay? We don't solve the indicators crisis by more indicators. We don't solve the citation indicators by putting more. We need less. And go back to qualitative evaluation and probably less evaluation in the system. And we are, again, lucky, I think, here in Quebec and in Canada, because the state, the fact that higher education is a provincial competency rather than a federal competency has led to, I would say, mostly a hands-off system, as well as the fact that higher education is heavily state subsidized versus private universities that actually play a competition role. We're very fortunate here. But we need still to push. We need not to let what's happening in the US percolate here and keep our qualitative evaluation that we have. Just so we know, at Université Montréal, we're unionized. And I think you guys are unionized here, which means that I've been evaluated 3 times in my career, and I'm done. I will never be evaluated again, which you can say leads to adverse effects, but at least doesn't lead to a big apparatus of evaluation that takes a lot of resources. Then you need to work with emulation so that people keep to be motivated on their jobs. But our evaluation systems is very light.
I think we would need so much more time to discuss. look at my notes, but time is running. I'm maybe briefly wrap up of what we heard. So less metrics is better.
Yes.
Capping the journal articles or the publications would be a recommendation. Focusing more, emphasizing qualitative parts of evaluation. And what I also took out of your talk and all the discussions is that there needs to be a systemic change of this evaluation processes. So not only one university, but there needs to be also changes on behalf of the publishers, changes, maybe even more governing the whole publishing and evaluating process. Maybe a very, very last question from the perspective of a student. Now, let's imagine we have a student who has disruptive results in natural science, engineering, PhD student, and they have the possibility, the opportunity, very likely to land a Nature paper. What would you recommend?
Right, they go for it.
Yeah.
Of course.
It's
but
the
then you don't
currency.
pay the APCs. And then, no, but let's be clear, because basically the publishing experience with Nature is great because they have the money to have real engagement with your paper. The review reports are good. The biggest issue with scholarly publishing, we name Nature, but it's what we make of Nature. It's not what Nature intrinsically is. The biggest issue with scholarly publishing are all of the lambda journals of Elsevier that we pay gazillions of dollars for, that all of their work is based on volunteering by academics, and that are just the normal paper, because you don't land many of those per year. If we were only publishing, what I mean is a small number of papers, irrespective of where it is, that would make sense. The biggest issue is that you're telling me I need to publish 20 a year to be good, then I'll publish in all of those lambda journals that are basically making the Elsevier's profit. Nature, Springer, does not make as much money per paper with Nature than it does with all of the lambda journals for which there's no proofreading, no one's paid in the editorial staff of the journal, while Nature has editors that work full-time at assessing the papers and stuff. So to answer shortly, I would say yes, and I think our thing that we need to stop focusing too much on Nature, but we need to probably restrict the number of journals at the world. And of course, this is something that is inconvenient to say, but we need to publish less. We need to restrict the number of journals. Because if we were to go in let's say a max of 4, capping the paper, that can be done several ways. You can say you can only put 4 papers on your C, but we could say, okay, everyone has 4 papers a year to publish, max. After that, it doesn't count. So, voila.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
For your presentation and for the discussion. Thank you all. And I'm now giving the floor to Holly.
Just a couple quick points. Thank you once again to all the speakers, Tanja and especially Vincent, for coming across Montreal to join us today. It's very, very generous. And I just wanted to note again, the next event in this series, February 12th, same place, same time, same format. Kelly Colby will be speaking on the theme of open science and academic assessment. And you're all welcome to stay until 2:30 or so if you have any other questions to discuss, if you have any other questions for Vincent, and if you would like some coffee and to finish your lunch if you didn't get it. So thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks again, everyone, for coming in for today's conversation today. Those of you online, we will be closing up the Zoom and the live stream now. Appreciate all of your questions there, too. And as Holly said, please join us again for the next installment. Have a great afternoon. See you soon.